I developed this topic in large part thanks to, initially at least, the sources that I came across. I received excellent advice from my PhD advisors that if I was interested, as I was, in the history of the early Soviet state, a good place to look for information would be the papers of the People's Commissariat of Government Control, which later became Rabkrin, or the Worker Peasant Inspectorate. And the sources I found there were truly remarkable, not just for the breadth of topics that they covered, but also for the intimacy of the view that they gave onto everyday life at an extraordinary moment, at a moment that was not at all quotidian or usual. And I found in going through these papers that an omnipresent theme was the struggle to determine what to do with things in the wake of a socialist revolution. I found that this question absorbed not just the commanding heights of the economy, as it had been considered in a lot of the historiography on the Soviet Union, but people at absolutely every stage of life and every status, people who were not formally involved in politics. So these papers building on these sources, which were in many cases complaints from people who felt that the revolution had in some way gone wrong at the moment that it intersected with their lives, I began to build these stories around the fate and the disposition of particular kinds of objects. I think that one of the things I ended up finding was that the experience of the revolution, that the material things offered this window onto both the experience of revolution on the one hand and the formation of the Soviet state on the other. That in fact these were mutually constitutive processes, that people were trying to make the revolution through things, and in so doing they in effect summoned the state into being and into their everyday lives. I mean, one of the things that we view as being most unique and the most difficult to understand about sort of high totalitarianism, if we can think of it that way, is its porousness, its fluid, the fluidity of what previously had been cast as state-society relations. The Cheka was extremely significant. The Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission against, for the battle against sabotage, counter-revolution, and crime on the job and speculation. It acquired more and more battles against as time went on. It is commonly known as being the agency that was involved in arresting enemies of the revolution. In the course of these arrests, however, the Cheka rarely left without taking material things as well as people when they visited apartments. So the Cheka came to perform searches in people's apartments, on the streets, all across the city of Moscow as soon as it arrived in the spring of 1918. And in the course of these searches, the Cheka would, as I said, take both people and things, and it created a series of procedures for dealing with material life that became extremely influential throughout the Soviet state. And one of these procedures that I discuss in great detail is the attempt to create inventories of individual households, of objects that the state is seizing, that became, in effect, a way for this new state to get a hold on what it had. I mean, this is the big story that I think my manuscript is dealing with, is how does this new Soviet state deal with this huge material inheritance that it takes on for itself. This process is known by the term nationalization, but in fact at the time it went by a lot of other names. It went by municipalization, socialization, governmentalization. There was no one authority that directed or controlled it. There was no one decree that authorized it. In fact, most of the legal orders that surrounded this process were issued only at the end, which is to say to end the process that became a very popular one of dispossession. The Chekal was intimately involved in this process of dispossession through the fact that it was the institution of all those of the Soviet state that was most likely to enter into people's homes in the course of its work. So the Chekal was a center, a locus for information about material life, as well as one of the main kind of vacuums of the new state that sucked up movable property and gathered knowledge about what people had and then determined how to manage it through its very capacious stockrooms and these inventory procedures. There were as many, I think, responses to dispossession as there were people in the former Soviet empire. One of the most common that I examine, because these are the types of documents that ended up in the hands of this institution that I started out looking at, Rab Krin, are people who are complaining about having been dispossessed. One of those that I examine in some detail is the case of a woman named Citizeness Tikhobrasova, who left the city of Petrograd just a few days after the October Revolution in 1917 in order to follow her son to the city of Armavir in the Caucasus. This was a prudent move in that it allowed Tikhobrasova to personally, physically escape the fractious and violent period of revolution in Petrograd, but it turned out to cause her a lot of problems in that first, going to the Caucasus was a sort of shorthand in the revolutionary era for being counter-revolutionary, for wanting to wait and see and hope that the Bolsheviks fell. And second, because when she returned to the city of Petrograd 3 years later, on New Year's Eve in 1920, she was denied access to the storage unit where she had left her household before she went to Armavir. And in a chapter dealing with movable goods or personal possessions, I don't want to give more specificity to this category of things than existed at the time because there was a lot of confusion around what was movable, what was immovable, what was property and what word we should use to describe it. But so the things inside apartments is the way that I think of it in my own mind. Tikhobrasova returned to Petrograd and set about the task of getting her stuff back. And I've traced her progress through multiple institutions of the early Soviet state as they themselves tried to work out what the previous 3 years, this cacophonous process of dispossession had meant, and how they now faced the task of reforming or reestablishing some mechanism for hanging on to stuff without at the same time legitimating private property. And so Tikhobrasova's case gives us entry to the legal struggles, the moral and ethical dilemmas, the administrative obstacles to drawing back from this kind of anarchic process that had characterized the revolution, that the Bolsheviks had, if not endorsed, at the very least, enabled and allowed to persist for 3 years until this moment when they find that it is damaging their legitimacy, their own authority, their own ability to hang on to the things that they want. And so they try to build some new order out of it. So my project moves from the very beginning of the revolution, this very popular process of dispossession and the fluidity that it creates between the many people acting in the process, who are both state agents and thieves and regular people, and the difficulty of determining who falls into what category at what moment, into the effort to what we might think of as end this phase, at least, of the revolution as an experience, as I characterize it. One of the main ways that the Bolsheviks begin to change what we might think of as property relations in the early 1920s occurs, I think, not just in the passage of the civil codes in the early to mid 1920s, but also directly through these efforts to put a stop to practices that have become so prevalent during the revolutionary era, like dispossession. So through the case of Citizeness Tika Brazova, the one that I mentioned earlier, we can trace the development of decrees and regulations dealing not so much with a positive definition of private property and rights to personal possession, but rather with an effort to deal with the fallout from the past 3 years. The fact that it wasn't just the state in a neat form, in a clearly demarcated state society that took things, that nationalized or municipalized, but in fact it was people who knew one another. It was neighbors and neighbors. And once the Bolsheviks attempt to put an end to or to constrain the practice of requisition and confiscation that had become so widespread, many people who've lost things see an opportunity to try to get their stuff back. And they bombard the new regime with petitions asking for, if not the actual return of their objects, then at least compensation for the things that they've lost, because according to the new rules, they shouldn't have lost them to begin with. And so the state struggles to cobble together rules determining what was legitimate dispossession in the revolutionary era, what was illegitimate dispossession in the revolutionary era, and how to consider the state's rights to take its subjects' things going forward. And the basic conclusion that they come to is that they can't enter into any consideration of what happened before April 1920, that the process was too anarchic, that it would be impossible now to determine who was a thief, who was a corrupt official, who was an opportunistic neighbor. And so all of the things that were lost or changed hands in that period will remain that way. And in so doing, I think they create a sort of vision of what the revolution was, and they ensconce it in laws as a distinct period in their history. And to my mind, that is the definition of coming to an end of revolution, not objective circumstances that we can, as outside observers, identify as being, a hypocritical inversion of an ideology or a doctrine, but rather a moment when historical actors see the period that they think of as revolution as closed. And so that's the process I described there. No, so the project began with my interest in the formation of the early Soviet state, and what better place to look for the story of how the Soviet state came into being than the story of how it attempted in March 1918 to pick itself up and put itself on trains and move down to a new capital, the city of Moscow. On March 11th, Lenin and his government boarded a train to Moscow. It was attacked along the way. It was defended by Latvians, those powerful guards of the revolutionary elite. And when Lenin arrived in Moscow, the new government faced the task of putting itself into a city that was the commercial heart of the Russian Empire, that had been cast down as a village, as a wooden village for the last several hundred years. And I wanted to look at the process of how the Soviet state unplugged itself from a capital that had been purpose-built for it in physical space, in layout, in arrangement, and then put itself into this new place. That project was interrupted by the fact that I wasn't given access to the archives of the city of Moscow in the revolutionary period, for any period of the Mosssoviet, the Moscow Soviet, before 1928. In the course of researching that transformation, however, I was able to gather a great deal of material about the government's sort of physical life in the months right after the Russian Revolution, how it went about consuming urban space in Moscow, its new capital. And it became clear that a lot of processes that we take for granted were in fact extraordinarily difficult. How, walking down the street, did these strangers to the city of Moscow sort of visually penetrate the buildings that they stood before and find out where they could put themselves? How did they find space to house tens of thousands of government workers who, despite the fact that there was no more threat of German invasion, which was ostensibly the reason why the government left in March 1918, they raced down to Moscow. They came so fast that the Commissariat of Agriculture, for example, worked on its train for weeks until it was able to find some office space to put its employees and their families. So the very question of how to find space for the new government turned out to be really hard to answer, and it required first you find in the documents these records of these pay stubs for people who are identified by trade only as Muscovites. Their sole defining characteristic being their knowledge of the city that they could offer as guides to the Sovnarkom, to these government institutions. So this question of the physical existence of the new Soviet state appeared before me as a key to the creation of this state, in fact. And I began to look into the material life of the early Soviet state. And once you start to pursue that line of questioning, it's impossible not to end up in the offices of the CHK, of the Extraordinary Commission for Sabotage and Counter-Revolution. The CHK was a voracious consumer of things in the early Soviet period, thanks to its nightly presence inside people's apartments, in the course of which it gathered not just things, but a lot of information that became very useful for the Soviet state in its effort to build itself out. We have to remember, not just according to neoclassical markers of economic life and success was the Soviet state kind of in trouble at this moment. There was a dearth of things, there was a dearth of food, there was radical inflation that was only getting worse. So the problem of provisioning loomed large, not just for everyday people, but also for the government. And so by following the process of how the government supplied itself, you begin to see how this relationship between state and society that has started to break down already in the First World War becomes further fluid, becomes more and more fluid, gets further and further reoriented through, in large part, I argue, this practice of seizure and dispossession that the CHK was so involved in. As evidence of its involvement, one of the most remarkable records I found was an audit that was performed by an employee of the People's Commissariat of Government Control, which became the Worker Peasant Inspectorate in subsequent years, Rabkrin as it was known. It's a remarkable document that attests to government controls, to Rabkrin's sort of in-between state at this moment, having begun as what we might think of as sort of the Russian imperial equivalent of what's known in the United States as the General Accounting Office, the body that audits other government bodies. It rapidly found itself out of work in the after a socialist revolution in which the authorities claimed not to recognize the informational or symbolic power of money. Rabkrin officials, however, were very enterprising, and they found new work for themselves. They determined to hold the government to account, not just in a fiscal sense, but in the sense of living up to its own ideals and its own stated goals. So this document, this audit document that a government controller performed over the course of several months in the fall of 1918, is really a remarkable picture of the Cheka's role, not just in political life, but in economic and material life during the Russian Revolution. It describes a vast basement storeroom where one can find everything from children's toys to spoiled food to bars of gold and silver to rich diamond necklaces and furs. And it's the only audit, it's the only document of its kind that I've been able to find, that I've been able to see, but it speaks to the role that the Cheka played in making the revolution in material life, which after all, this is a socialist revolution, kind of is the revolution itself. And it also speaks to the Cheka's sort of the fashion for the Cheka and the power of the Cheka within the Soviet state, because one can see through this accounting document that the Cheka is a purveyor of goods, not just for its own agents, but for other agencies of the Soviet state. There's a series of great letters, correspondences between Vladimir Bonch-Boroyevich, who's Lenin's assistant at the Sovnarkom, and Dzerzhinsky's assistant at the Cheka, in which Bonch-Boroyevich asks Peters, this assistant, for leather coats, like the ones that the Chekists themselves wear, which have evidently become perhaps just fashionable or perhaps real symbols of authority, physical, visual symbols of authority in the city of Moscow that Bonch-Boroyevich wants his own agents to be able to wear. And although the Cheka grants many such requests from the Sovnarkom for typewriters, for material, for suits, shoes for wives and children, this was a request that the Cheka denied. My next project will move from the revolutionary period into the era that I had in many ways wanted to investigate for my first work, and now am getting the chance to do for my second work, to the question of poverty in late socialism. Poverty being a problem that was omnipresent in the Soviet system but did not officially exist, and was a problem or a concept that grew more acute as the Soviet system began to open itself up to the outside world, because it's a relational problem. It exists as compared to another space, as compared to, in this case, the West. So I hope to examine the conceptualization and phenomenon of poverty and impoverishment in 4 areas of late socialist life, in sociology, in attempts to study poverty, and particularly the work of Soviet sociologists who had Gorbachev's ear. One of the major advancements or the achievements of perestroika was in the publication of open and free documentation of the economic life of Soviet subjects. So sociology in urban life, in the sort of persistent awareness of neighborhoods that were richer or poorer, and attempts of Soviet architects and urban planners to ameliorate in these cities. Third, in Soviet development projects, both within the Soviet Union and abroad, and finally in Soviet cultural production and films, such as the sort of hyper-realist films of the late Soviet period. Interdevotchka is actually the movie that got me started on this project for its very raw depiction of the economic and the material and the spiritual poverty of the Soviet Union in the late period.